All right, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's webinar hosted by Astrix entitled Mastering Change Management, Proven Strategies for AI and Beyond. Today's presentation, again, is brought to you by Astrix and will be presented by Stephen Anderson, our Vice President of Advisory Services here at Astrix, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And before we get into the presentation, you go to the next slide, Stephen. We will just tell you a little bit about who Astrix is. If you've never been on one of our webinars before, we certainly welcome you. If you're a return visitor of some of our webinars, thank you for coming back. Who we are as a company. Astrix for about 30 years now. We brought a very unique blend of highly specialized strategic and technical services, as well as process and technology agnostic approach that has made us a leading partner in transforming the success of life sciences and science-based organizations, particularly in digital transformation. A couple of things that are of note. Again, we've been doing this now for 30 plus years. We serve the scientific community almost exclusively, and over 90% of the staff that currently work at Astrix hold advanced science degrees. So we're very much a science-based company helping other science-based companies. And again, a lot of our work is around strategy and helping people choose and build the right technology stacks depending on their unique needs. So with that, that's a little bit about who Astrix is. Let me introduce our speaker, and then I'll hand it over to Stephen. He can take us through the rest of the presentation. So Stephen brings a wealth of transformation program management, as well as organizational change management experience to his role, leading IT global M&A, digital transformation programs at life science companies. And over the course of his career, he has successfully led global large-scale implementations, digital lab transformations, as well as global operational consolidation. So we're thrilled to have Stephen with us today. I know he's got a very busy schedule, so it's great to get him on one of our webinars and lend his expertise to these areas. With that, Stephen, I'll let you drive from here and I'll come back on at the end to help with questions.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Good day, everyone. So in order to talk about, managing change and AI disruption and digital transformation, I wanted to cover like 6 various topics over the next 30 minutes or so, just to talk about some examples of AI disruption in life sciences, give an analogy to talk about how I look at, managing change in the state of, business and operational disruption. How do you reinforce that change? What are some of the change enablers, adoption levers, and empowering that change? So let me get started. So there's many various examples of AI enablement across the pharma value chain. I'm not going to drain the slide on examples, but when you look at each of the examples, the thing that I like to look at when we're looking at AI to really drive a disruption or a new way of working is like, what are some of the principles around that AI implementation? And the first is really, it must lead with value. So when you're looking at applying AI, it really needs to drive to either a business outcome or scientific outcome that's yielding bottom line value to the corporation. The other thing that AI presents that many companies overlook is it's a way to reinvent ways of working, and in many ways, you're able to digitize workflows. So I get lots of questions around, the companies are afraid that, the workforce is going to rebel against AI. But in reality, over 70% of AI transformations, it's not eliminating work, it's redefining work. So some of that work gets digitized, but actually new work is created. So it's not all just taking work away, it's redefining that work. And then when you want to look at, really committing to AI, you have to establish an AI digital core so that you set up the scalable infrastructure and architecture that can, operate and scale AI based on the global complexity and the size of the solution. And then one thing a lot of people do forget is that you need to build in, responsible AI. So from an ethical governance and those types of frameworks, make sure you have that built in to really govern the solution. And then what AI also presents is the way to actually introduce continuous reinvention or continuous improvement. So a lot of the AI programs I've been involved with, it starts out with almost a minimum viable product implementation, but then it evolves and keeps improving and providing more and more operational change and value to the corporation. So let me just provide a real live analogy of how I like to look at, managing that change. So my wife and I like to go out to eat a lot. And one thing I've noticed over the time is uh, is that you restaurants will rarely just come out and change a menu like in the middle of a season. But what the restaurant owners and cooks like to do is they like to preview specials. And what those specials, if those specials are really successful, then it's actually a way of actually adding new items to the menu or overhauling the menu in total. So if you think about when you're going to a restaurant, you go there because you're interested in the food that they serve. But what it draws you into it, if you have a favorite restaurant, is what are the ingredients and how is it made? What makes this dish really good and appealing to customers? And what's the plan to observe and improve the menu? And that really applies to how we approach change, because when you look at the whole change effort, you really have to look at what is the degree of change that's being you know that's being created by this AI or digital transformation. And in order to really put that in context for the general population, you really have to put it in, what is the strategic intent? What's the business or scientific intent that we're trying to drive? And then for what's in that change, what are the features, components that are being implemented really change the way people do their business? Because the one thing about change is you always got to look at it in terms of, it's looking at it in terms from the people lens, and specifically what knowledge, what capabilities they need to do their job in the future environment. So once you have an idea of that workload and the impact on the people and their knowledge, then you really got to look at defining, what's the benefit of this change, what problem does it solve, and then what value is delivered to the corporation. And then at the end of it, it's really looking at when we get ready for go live and enact this change, you know, it's what's the leadership vision, what's the scale up plan. So how do we make sure when we go live, this grabs traction, gets adopted, and then is successful moving forward. So the conclusions that I like to draw from this is that you really, you don't just, when you're looking at change, you don't try to take it and do all, big bang change all at once. Just like rolling out a new dish, like a chef would pilot a new dish as a special, you'd want to take a pilot group through the change, make sure you observe their interactions, run surveys on the users so they understand how effective was the training and the change, and then you incorporate that feedback in the feedback loop. So before you go live and do the full deployment, you have a well-refined change approach that's ready to scale up and support the whole deployment population. And what I like to pull into this is, we're leading a global, QC LIMS transformation for one of the top 10 pharmas. And the way we started that with each of the sites when we go live, and we're going live to over 25 sites, we start with a pilot approach. So before we even get started on, talking to the sites and looking at change, we bring in a model lab execution environment for a week, and we walk through some of the sample QC tests, the way it works in the target environment, the new roles and responsibilities for the testers, so that they're getting their hands on the actual solution 6 months before go live. And then we use that feedback to tweak the go live plan for that site, and then set up the various changes in motion to drive that, manage that change and the readiness for that change over the 5 months through the go live. So change doesn't just happen overnight. It needs to be constantly reinforced and driven into the end users through a multiple methods and media. When we look at change, I like to break it down into people reinforcement and and process reinforcement. So we think of people. I like to start with leadership modeling and a change champion network. And the greater the size of the transformation in the program, the greater the impact on the organization and operations, the greater the need for like top-down leadership. it's clearly important that for the lab users, the lab analysts, lab managers, for them to grasp on and support the system, they need support from the top, and it goes down through layers. So the executives down to the directors, down to the managers, down to the supervisors, down to the lab analysts. So it starts at the top, but then that champion network is actually a change network that covers all layers of the organization. And for each of the deployment sites, it covers all areas of the site. So it's a change network with multiple layers crossing all the users so that they have someone to lean on when you go live that are actually very conversant in the system and the new ways of working. And then what I find very important for people reinforcement is, recognize early adopters. So when there are early wins, early adopters, in our programs, we call that out with, communications, very broad structured communications on here's what's, for the pilot site, here's how many users went live, here's the use of the system, and here's how many, tests are being conducted in the system in the new pilot site. And then that feeds into really, transparent updates. So when you look at the change activities that have to occur before go live and through go live, you really set up a cadence of periodic communication and updates to the end user audience on here's the degree, here's what's coming for change, here are the specific timelines when you need to complete your training. And then what we do for our program is we actually set up a SharePoint site for each of the roles that are affected by the change. So that SharePoint site contains links to training refreshers, links to job aids, links to role descriptions if the roles for each the role descriptions are changing for each of the users and analysts in the system. And then once we get that established, we establish ongoing refreshers for periodic training refreshers and links to that SharePoint site so that those job aids and training aids are constantly available for our end user base. From a process reinforcement, I like to look at it as what are the processes we're going to follow to really make sure that this change is grabbing and taking hold in the user base and that it's actually enabling them to really be fully ready for jumping back to full productivity after go live. So we establish clear escalation paths both within the site and then within the global team running the program. And then we establish those governance feedback loops so that there's always a opening if users have questions or need clarity on the change in training. We have that feedback loop with a great degree of tools to support that. And then we come out with a structured communication plan starting at 6 months before go live with structured communications all the way through go live and hypercare after we go live. And then the other thing we make sure, since most of our deployments are in GXP, GMP environments, we make sure that the changes that are required for this new way of working are reflected into SOP work instruction changes and eventually into the workflows. So we make sure those are embedded, confirmed, 2 months before go live, so that all the business and compliance quality requirements are done before we hit the go live switch and flip to go into production. When I think of change enablers, I really like to focus on 6 areas. So one is, really the clarity around what is changing, what is change and how does this affect every, type of user, every role within the lab and or the scientific operation. So we have to frame it up and what's in it for each of the roles so that we can clearly define what's in it for them. Well, how does this help them be more productive in their job, after we get through the production switch and go live. And then the second thing we focus on is really impact awareness. So before we come into the site, we look at, what were the existing roles, workflows, how were people working? And then we model out through the model lab, how should they be working in the target environment So we look at that impact, the change impact on each of the roles, and use that to really define and document what's the new way of working, what are the expectations we have to set with each of the roles, the people in those roles, and how they need to be prepared to be fully productive on day one after the system goes live. And then the third area we look at is like, capabilities. So when I talked about like knowledge and capabilities, it's really what skills and core capabilities do the end users need to be fully operational in the new model and the new ways of working after we deploy the solution. So it's really mapping out what's their current capabilities before we bring in this program, what additional capabilities are required, and then we model that out in terms of that capability transition to make sure they're aware of all the capabilities and skills required to be successful on day one. On the other side, the next one we were talking was like support structure. So when I mentioned having like a SharePoint site with training, job aids, processes, we set up a structured, you know, SharePoint site that mirrors, the user base and the operational base that we're deploying to, so that we have a structured set of content with multiple different media types, multiple, options for people to look at for job aids and training to make sure they are fully versant in the new ways of working before the system gets deployed. And then the fifth one is really communication. So throughout the process, I like to emphasize we really over communicate with clear, consistent messaging. And it's really the goal is really to build understanding and awareness in the whole user base, and it's to build that trust in the new solution. Because if you can get them to trust the new solution, trust that they're capable to operate in the new environment, you're getting them ready to feel confident that they can be fully operational in their job day one once the system goes live. And the last thing we look at is capacity. So really the amount of work and that has to flow through the operation. So if it's QC and testing, it's the amount of testing that has to get done on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and making sure with this system switch, the users have the time and the bandwidth to absorb that change and then be able to be fully operational after the change. That's why we bring in this 6-month go live effort beforehand to give enough time that they can fully grasp the change that's coming and what it's delivered, so that they are confident on day one that they can be up and running and fully versed in the system. So now let me talk about adoption levers. So when we think about, having users adopt the system and really get into really being able to work in the new system, what we try to look at are 4 different areas. One is, the motivation. So, what I found over my many years of implementing systems and driving organization change and adoption is there are people learn through many different ways. So you need to be able to come up with many different types of training and media. So what we have done for our clients is we have, instructor-led training. When we do the instructor-led training, we record it so it's on video, so people can go back and look at it for refreshers. But then we also do, as I spoke about in the prior, like job description. So if the job description is materially changing in this new environment, we have it documented and readily available for, reinforcement and guidance throughout the whole process. But we try to make sure that the end users are motivated for this new environment and they feel comfortable that they've been armed with everything they need to be successful once the system goes live. And then as we to the next level, really talking about anticipation for the new system. So we try to make the users uh, feel fully prepared for this new system. And part of that is really as we go through the months going up before the go live, it's understanding the various areas of resistance across the lab or the operation and coming up with tactics and responses to really address the resistance and overcome it before we get to go live. Because the last thing you want is like user resistance or hesitance after go live, because that will delay really driving the adoption of the system and driving getting the full value out of the system after you deploy it. The third area of adoption levers is really mindset, the psychological journey. So one thing we really try to focus on is establishing, psychological safety for the communication, training, and this whole transition to the new environment, so that all the users feel psychologically safe in this transition. They feel like the whole process, transition, operational change is being communicated through them. So they feel part of the process. They're comfortable with that change. And we hope that they feel comfortable, that they feel motivated to be ready and, fully versant, to be, excited for day one, not really, not really, ignoring or, uh, hesitant about day one, but Joe in and really jumping in and really wanting to go full blown in the new way of working. And then the last adoption level is reinforcement. So what I like to say about communications, training, and end user involvement is that constant reinforcement is key. So we put out there constant reinforcement messages and communications. We established a feedback loop so that if people do have questions, they can get those surfaced in a safe, efficient manner to the core change team, and then that can get back out to them in terms of structured responses. And then we do, on our project, we implement employee recognition programs to really, nominate and recognize the people that have, we introduce gamification. So in terms of games and training, we do recognize the people that score highest on the training, to try to drive that competitiveness of trying to get people that really want to succeed in the new program. And then what we also do for reinforcement and mechanisms is we institute end user surveys after go live to really talk about, did the training fully meet your needs? What could be improved through training? And how comfortable did the users feel that they could be, fully versed in their job day one and week one, week two of the project. So it's really trying to gauge the success of the training program and then be able to tweak it, make any changes before we move to the next deployment. Uh, the other thing I'd like to talk about is really, change tension. So one of the things we do often see is there's a lot of resistance to change. And some of that really comes down to the mindset gap, where you have leadership really trying to drive innovation, adaptation, new ways of working, trying to drive digital or AI transformation to progress the business. And that really introduces, it challenges standing habits, it challenges people's comfort zone. As I said earlier on, introducing AI really introduces new behaviors, new ways of working, and new responsibilities. So those introduce, you know, fear and doubt into the end users. So one of the things we really focus on when we're materially changing the operation through either AI or through digital transformation is looking at, how are things working in the old structure? What are the possible either fear, resistant that users could have to this new way of working, and proactively coming out with targeted approaches in terms of communications, really highlighting the new ways of working. What are the new measurements and how that will actually, this solution will actually help them drive better measurements and KPIs for the solution. So what we really focus on is how do you reduce that change tension through the various levers that we use across the organization change process. And they can be people lever, process lever, communication levers. It's not, it all depends on what exact situation we're dealing in. So I am going to wrap things up now, and Kevin, we can get to question and answer.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. We're going to do a couple things here real quick. I'm going to get the recording on this